Hey everybody, it's Ron, and I want to tell you a story about business and how that story changed everything. The phone rang at Kingsley Hill a little after 5 o'clock on Saturday afternoon, August 26th, 1967, in the quiet Sussex countryside of Warbleton, England, about 65 miles north of London. Peter Brown picked it up, already half expecting who it would be. The voice on the other end sounded groggy, thick, a little apologetic, the voice of a man who'd had a rough go of the last 24 hours and knew it. He was sorry for leaving so abruptly the night before. He'd eat something, watch a bit of television, read through his mail, and then he'd head back to Warbleton. Peter told his friend to take it easy, maybe come by train rather than risk driving in his condition. The man on the phone agreed easily enough and said he'd call again soon with the details of which train Brown should meet him at. But the man never called back. Peter waited through the evening, then through the next morning, the silence stretching longer than made sense for a man who'd promised a simple phone call. By the time the truth reached him, it came secondhand, relayed down a phone line from a locked-down bedroom in London that had just been broken open, a doctor's face gone white, a friend found in bed as if merely asleep. The man who called Brown, sounding groggy and apologetic the day before, was gone. Peter Brown didn't get to sit with that for very long. As the man's personal assistant and the executive director of his company, Peter had a responsibility. Probably the toughest one of his entire life. Within hours, he was the one holding a telephone again, this time dialing a number he'd been given for a retreat in Bangor, Wales, where 4 of the most famous men on earth were spending their weekend cross-legged in front of a guru, learning to meditate, blissfully unaware that the man who'd built the entire structure of their fame was already gone. Peter Brown asked to speak to Paul McCartney, and just like that, the same news that had reached him secondhand became his to deliver firsthand. So what does it actually take to build an empire so completely invisible that almost nobody realizes it's there until the person running it isn't? What happens to 4 young men who'd never once had to think about contracts or bookings or business the moment the man handling all of it is suddenly gone? And how did one weekend, ending on August 27th, 1967, turn Peter Brown into both the last person to hear Brian Epstein's voice and the first to say his name out loud in the past tense? From Business Basics, I'm Ron Trucks, and this is Business History, the daily podcast where we explain the stories that changed business forever. Every date on the calendar has a story where business reshaped the world. Today, August 27th, that story takes us to 1967, the man behind the Beatles. And before we go any further, worth saying plainly, Brian Epstein was not related to Jeffrey Epstein, a name you may be familiar with nowadays from the news, in any way. Different man, different family, 6 decades apart. This is Brian Epstein, the man who built the Beatles into a business. Brian Epstein came from a prosperous Liverpool, England retail family, and nothing in his early life pointed towards the music business. He drifted through boarding schools, a stretch in the army, and training as an actor before settling into a far more conventional role, running a company called NEMS, North End Music Store. It was his family's record shop. He had 0 experience managing a band, none at all, when a customer walked in one afternoon in 1961 asking for a record he couldn't locate. That was a small mystery that led him, out of simple curiosity, to the Cavern Club to see the group everybody kept mentioning. What he saw that day at the Cavern Club convinced him fast, and what he did next is the part most people underestimate. He pitched nearly every major label in London and got turned down by almost all of them before finally landing a deal with EMI's small parlor phone imprint. Through producer George Martin, a deal 4 scruffy Liverpool musicians with no connections and no professional polish could never have walked in and secured on their own. Epstein rebuilt their entire public image next, out of leather jackets and into matching suits, choreographed bows included, understanding instinctively that talent alone wasn't enough to get skeptical industry gatekeepers to take them seriously. The deal that would define everything going forward came next. Epstein negotiated a management contract giving him 25% of gross earnings, well above the 10% standard elsewhere in the industry at the time. Nobody around him questioned the number, because nobody yet knew how enormous the thing he was building would eventually become. Over the following years, Brian Epstein's fingerprints ended up on nearly everything that turned the Beatles from a talented band into a genuine commercial phenomenon. He secured their first American television appearances, including The Ed Sullivan Show, managed the sheer logistical chaos of touring through the height of Beatlemania, and in January 1967, renegotiated their EMI contract into a new 9-year deal guaranteeing NIMS, his company, 25% for the full term, regardless of what happened to his own management contract with the band that was coming up later that year. That last detail turned out to matter more than anyone realized at the time. As the band stopped touring in 1966 to focus purely on studio recording, the part of the business Brian understood best, live promotion, public presentation, became less central to what the Beatles actually did day to day. His own management contract was set to expire on September 30th, 1967, and he already knew the coming negotiation would cut his fee from 25% down to 10%, with NIMS losing its share of performance income entirely. As a gay, closeted man living in 1960s London, much of his double-sided life, as amazing as it was illegal. Contributing to the stress of coordinating the biggest entertainment group on the planet, he was managing addiction and chronic insomnia. He had checked into the Priory Clinic just weeks before his death and had buried his own father only weeks before that. The commercial architecture he had spent years building for 4 other people was, by every measure, working better for them than the arrangement was working for him. Once Brian Epstein was actually gone, his contribution became visible precisely because of how badly things went without him. The Beatles first tried managing their own business affairs directly, and it unraveled quickly enough that eventually they formed Apple Corps, an attempt to formalize the resulting chaos into something resembling structure. That didn't hold together either. Then, the band brought in Alan Klein as a new manager amid general internal disagreement, since Paul McCartney had wanted a different choice entirely, and that specific conflict became one of the direct fractures that contributed to the group's breaking up just a few years later. The mechanism is worth naming plainly here. Epstein's death didn't cause the Beatles to fall apart on its own. What it removed was the one person whose entire job had been quietly absorbing exactly the kind of business friction that eventually tore the band apart in public anyway. Contract disputes, competing management interest, unclear authority over decisions nobody had needed to make while Brian was alive to make them. Paul McCartney put it plainly decades later. Asked who deserved the title of the fifth Beatle? If anyone did, he said, it was Brian. Peter Brown, Brian's assistant, stayed on at Apple Corps in the years that followed, close enough to watch the very structure Epstein had built and held together almost invisibly come apart without him. He'd been the last person to hear Epstein's voice, ordinary and groggy, promising a phone call that never came, and the first person to say his name out loud in the past tense into a phone line stretching all the way to 4 men in Bangor, Wales. I'm Ron Trucks, and this is Business History, the podcast that finds the turning points behind the headlines. To hear more stories like this, follow us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you listen. And if you're enjoying the stories, please don't forget to subscribe and leave a quick review. It helps more people find the story behind the business. And if you want to actually understand business better without the fluff, the buzzwords, or the MBA language, start by visiting businessdailypodcast.com.